People who work in hospital, what is the worst thing you have seen a patient go through? When I was in high school, I took a CNA course. We did our clinicals at a state-run nursing home. There was one patient who was 89 years old, had stage 4 pancreatic cancer and dementia. She was married at one point, but her husband passed. They had 8 children, all of them pass. All of her siblings, friends, and close relations pass. She first entered the home about 4 years before she died once she realized she really couldn't care for herself anymore. Because of age, general health problems that accompany living for 85 years, and later developed the other ailments. By the time I got there, most days, she didn't know where she was, but would have days where she was lucid. She would remember her cancer and that she was alone. Those days, she would cry a lot. As the lucid days got further and further apart as her physical health declined, she got to where she would only eat if I was the one feeding her. I went in on weekends and after school to try and get her to eat and drink something. Watching that poor woman have to face the reality of her cancer over and over again, then realize she was alone in the world was horrible. The day she died, I walked by her room as they were cleaning her things and saw a picture of her sister. We didn't look identical to one another, but we favored each other. I think she thought I was her sister. People imagine horrible ways to die, but dementia is by far the worst way to go. Story 2. I had a 94-year-old woman who had been beaten by her niece so horribly that she was intubated and in the ICU. This woman was in pure agony, and her family wanted to do everything for her. Come to find out, they were keeping her alive and collecting her social security check. While cleaning her up, she grabs my arm and holds it tight. Huge tears well up in her eyes. She looks at me and mouths over the tube, "I want to pass. Please let me go." That night, I sobbed the entire way home. Story 3. I cleaned the rooms of the ER in my local hospital as a summer job. This woman in her 40s was dying from cancer, and she had a room in the ER for a couple days to wait for another room in another service. She looked fine for someone who was dying. I mean, she was bald and looked ill, but she was nice and lovely to be around, cheerful, etc. One time I was cleaning the corridor when I heard cries from her room. I opened the door and there she was on the floor. She fell from her bed after trying to walk to the bathroom. I helped her to the bathroom as she was crying. In pain and in fear because she realized she could not walk anymore and that her end was coming, she broke my heart. It was the first I realized where I was really working. Story 4. ICU. Lady who was roughly 40 paralyzed from the chest down due to car accident years prior. Currently on a ventilator through a trash and had a permanent feeding tube inserted in her stomach. When I saw her, she had a bleed in her stomach that was seeping out through the tube. They ended up having to sedate her pretty heavily to keep her from repeatedly pulling the tube out. Seeing her pulling the tube loose and watching her actively begin to pass with a totally blank look in her eyes was chilling. Story 5. A guy got in a car accident and broke his back and was told that he'd never walk again. When they tried doing therapy, he started wiggling his toes, so some hope came back into the picture. The transport dropped him when transferring him from the bed to the stretcher and broke his back all over again. That was 20 years ago now, and he has never moved a toe again. Don't forget to lock the bed or brace the stretcher, kids. I also forgot about the little boy whose brother jumped off the top of the bunk bed to help him do the splits. Screams I will never forget. Story 6. Saw a couple lose their baby very suddenly one day before the due date. Saw a man get all of his affairs together and quit his job with a rare terminal illness, then live. Story 7. Got sent to the pediatric ICU to watch over an 18-year-old who want end his life. He broke the bones and lost all function of his eyes, for obvious reasons. He was very confused and obviously terrified. He had just learned he was going to be blind for the rest of his life. On top of all of this, his divorced parents were fighting. The dad blamed the mom. The mom then refused to let the dad visit by not giving him the special code you need to get on unit. It was the single most ducked-up night I've worked, and I refused to go to that unit ever again. Story 8. I was in my second clinical rotation as a nursing student. We were assigned patients, and the patient I was assigned to was a grumpy old guy who was 79. He had a good sense of humor, but you had to tread carefully around him. He had chronic pain and was diagnosed with cancer. His son would visit in the mornings just in time to talk to the doctors doing their morning rounds. His wife had passed a few years earlier. I was helping him get ready for breakfast when the doctor walked in. This was pretty typical, but he was anxious to see the doctor today as he just had a bunch of tests done and was hoping to hear some results so he could be discharged to go home. I usually just finish up whatever I am doing and leave so that the patient and doctor can talk privately. That morning his son was not able to make it in, and my patient asked if I could stay in the room with him to hear everything, in case he missed something. I said sure, no problem, as long as the doctor is okay with it as well. Some doctors don't like dealing with students. The doctor just got right to the point. The cancer had spread and there was nothing more they could do. The palliative team would be coming to meet with him this afternoon to discuss where he could be transferred to during his final days. My patient thought the doctor was joking and started to laugh and then just sat there with a completely blank look. As a student, I was not prepared to know how to comfort someone in that situation, as it was something I didn't have experience with. I felt awful because 10 minutes before he got this news, he was telling me he couldn't wait to see his cat once he got home. For the next week, he did not get out of bed, refused to eat and take medication or shower. And then I came in one day and he was transferred out. Story 9. Work in a mental health hospital. Damn dementia. Horrible, horrible disease that affects the people you love more than you because on the good days, you don't know you have it. I've seen people screaming out for their wife, husband who passed years ago. What do you tell them? Their pass? Why put them through that again? Do you lie and say they're on their way? Are shopping or something else, knowing that will placate them for 15 minutes until they ask again? Damn dementia, I don't think there's an illness worse. Story 10. Doctor here. Saw a previously very well-old lad who had fallen in his small bathroom and become trapped between the toilet and wall with his knees flexed. His thighs were pressed against the edge of the bowl and his feet were squeezed up behind him. Paramedics found him after about 48 hours in that position. He came to hospital with 2 completely muscle breakdown and renal failure. He'd pass about 2 hours later. Story 11. I volunteered in a children's hospital throughout high school. There was a 16-year-old patient there who had spina bifida and had no feeling beneath the waist. He had routine surgery and expected to be in the hospital for about a week. The worst thing I've ever seen was the look on his face when he told me that the doctors had found MRSA on both of his legs, and he wouldn't be leaving the hospital anytime soon. Hospital trips are kind of funny. The first week, everybody wants to visit you, but after that, guests seem to taper off dramatically. I remember him stating that the hardest thing for him was the lack of social support beyond his family, and to a much lesser extent myself, as this was like the year before Facebook really being a thing that everybody had. Happy ending, though. He eventually did recover from MRSA after spending around 6 months in the hospital. Story 12. Emergency room, an old lady came in. I don't know for what, but she came in from a nursing home. There is no way to describe accurately how horrific this woman's condition was. The patient didn't go through this in the hospital, so I don't know if it really answers your question, but here goes. Her hair was so matted and dirty that it seemed like the bugs who lived in it couldn't even get to the center of the dreadlock. They ended up cutting most of it off. Originally, we thought she had a napkin in her mouth or was eating toilet paper. Nope, just mold. I had to leave the room because I kept throwing up. This is on top of the regular poop and pee that they always come in with and smelling like, thank the Lord Jesus and all of his men for nurses, because those people handled the situation like champs. They cut her hair, patched her up, and cleaned her mouth. She looked and smelled and spoke like a new person. Story 13. While a student, family was hit by an 18-wheeler. Both children and wife were passed instantly. The husband wakes up 2 weeks later, and first thing he asked is about his family, watching them break the news to this poor guy. Story 14. Basically, anytime a patient, especially elderly, is hanging on with every possible form of life support, vent, dialysis, repetitive coding, and the family refuses to make them a DNR. I know it is a hard decision to make. I know you don't want to see them die. You also don't want to be in the room when they code. You don't want to be in the room the 3rd time they code, wondering if we will be able to bring your loved one back again, just to see his chest rise and fall mechanically. To see him being turned every hour and leaving the room so that your modest dad can have some privacy while we clean him up because he can't control his bowels. Please think about what the person would have wanted. Story 15. Hearing the news that their newly transplanted heart is being rejected by their body. Early stages are treatable and the protocol for testing is there for a reason. But even knowing all of that, it's scary as crap to be given another chance at life and then have it all be hanging in the balance again so soon. Story 16. Worked in an orthopedic clinic and we had a woman come in to have her shoulder replaced. She was pregnant. A man broke into her house with a shotgun, hit her husband and he passed, hit her in the shoulder, and then take his life away. I don't know the reason. All I know is that she was now a future single mother with a dominant arm that was basically non-functional. Story 17. I worked at the hospital in high school. I delivered food trays to hospital rooms, so it was a very easy job. We were encouraged to have brief conversations with the patients to try and cheer them up a bit. The hardest one to deal with was our high school principal. Our principal dealt with 2,700 students, but was beloved by all. Not often you find a person like that. Well, one day she got real sick and had to go to the hospital. I walked into her room and saw her in there. Somehow she remembered my name after I had only met her maybe twice. I saw her every day I worked and saw her degrading and degrading for months. All during this time, people in school had their rumors that she was getting better. Somebody's mom saw her shopping, people heard she was coming back next week, etc. I couldn't say anything, obviously. But it was very hard to deal with watching so many people have hope, and me knowing that this truly wasn't looking good. She died about 3 months into being in the hospital. The school was devastated. Story 18. Not exactly something I saw the patient go through, but I saw the sweetest old lady who was suffering with chronic kidney problems because when she was younger, she worked as a maid for some people who forbade her from using the toilet at work. So she had to force herself to hold a full bladder daily for hours at a time. This is a great way to get stones, which in turn can cause obstruction and damage the kidneys. She was so sweet and lovely, and it just really got to me that people could be so needlessly maleficent. Story 19. In clinical on a burn trauma unit, Guy had third-degree burns on 80% of his body. He was heavily medicated, but still, I can't even fathom the pain. I don't know if he made it because he was quite septic last time I was there. I now work in the NICU. Most of the babies end up doing pretty well and going home eventually, but some aren't so lucky. I could go on about the medical stuff, but really the worst is when their parents don't give a crap about them. Some parents live far away and have other kids to take care of, so it's understandable if they aren't there every day. But then there are others who never call, never visit, and no one can track them down. So the kid ends up being discharged to foster care. It just burns deep in my soul sometimes. One day I might hand a perfectly nice couple their baby to hold one last time while we withdraw life support. And the next day I'll be trying to soothe the baby withdrawing from the substances his Mia mom took. Story 20. During my MTE clinicals, I had to sit in the back of the ambulance with someone suffering from trigeminal neuralgia. The pain and agony that person was in, just horrible. I understood it was painful, but seeing it in person is a whole different story. Story 21. Tale from my mother who is a registered nurse. I was with a woman who couldn't poop, rubbing her back and coaxing her. When she finally pooped and stood up, I kid you not, it was the size of a G fruit. I'm surprised she didn't prolapse forcing that out. Story 22. I currently work on an intensive unit. I've seen so much, and I don't believe anything has hit me as hard as below. I was working at a mental health facility after graduating from undergrad. This facility was interesting. It was in a modest, ranch-styled house that was made specifically for this population. Open layout for easy supervision, panic buttons, etc. But mostly, it was a house, and the staff were the outliers. There were 8 clients at a time. They would either get hospitalized or go on to independent living. It was a step above being hospitalized. I got extremely close to these consumers and got to know them very well. I have many stories of their antics, good and bad memories, but I recall a certain individual whose situation really hurt. I was specifically hired for a man in his 60s, M, who had suffered a traumatic brain injury. M was a successful toy marketer in his past life, as his family called it. One day, 20-something years earlier, M got into a horrific car accident. He survived, but was cursed with poor memory and severe PTSD. And many psychological issues and physical concerns, M would scream every 2 minutes on the dot, begging staff to not bring him to the hospital. He would ask if he were okay. It was difficult for him to communicate, but he would get moments of clarity. He was a big man who seemed intimidating when he had these bouts. He had come to us with the diagnosis of bipolar with a history of abuse. M was never violent towards our staff, and we knew that he was pawned off to us because his insurance was no longer covering the hospitalization, and his family did not want to take care of him. It was a lot to take care of him, but he quickly stole a place in my heart. He remembered my name because his sister's name was the same, but other than that, he did not recognize any other staff members and did not remember his day-to-day living. He needed help showering and would be embarrassed to have a 20-something-year-old woman helping him and would cry, whispering, "Not fair." We watched Titanic every single shift together. He liked Rose and wouldn't scream when we would watch movies together. M loved diet root beer and would smile every so often when I brought it to him. When I indicated that he couldn't go to the hospital when I bought him root beer, he would be still until his next outburst. I would be able to successfully de-escalate once I showed him his diet root beer and helped him drink it. I bought 300 movies on VHS for us to watch together because it was the only thing that calmed him down. M was much more than his impairment. He was still a human. One who I grew fond of because I could not grasp the immeasurable pain he was in. His wife abandoned him after it was deemed he would not sign divorce papers. She wanted him to pass so that she could take his money. I never met her. He had sons, and he pleaded for them to come, but I only saw one once. He only stayed for a half hour. I think M saw me as his form of family, telling me that I was his daughter when he never had one. The other staff did not like M as much as me. They petitioned for him to be sent to a nursing home because his care was too much. I would miss M, but hoped for him a better life, mostly for him to have staff trained in adults with memory issues. I never got to say goodbye. He got transported by medical staff to his new nursing home. Fast forward a year, I'm happy in my new role, being promoted to a closer hospital to home. I get a text message from a past coworker. My old coworker sent me a lengthy email from M's sister. M's sister wrote that M began to decompensate very quickly. He was rarely changed or paid attention to. He was left alone in a dark room with no TV, nothing to occupy his mind. M had died, M's sister thanked me for the care I gave him. For our Scrabble matches, he would often make up words. I never let them fly. He would giggle. I think he thought he could pull one over on me. For our movie sessions, for all the joy I had brought to his life of worry. She signed that she was grateful and that she would never forget me. She thanked me again and told me that she could never repay me for the time I gave to her brother. I sat in my office, curled up in a ball, and sobbed for 10 minutes. I couldn't believe that the stubborn, forgetful, aloof M that I knew was gone. I sobbed because I didn't get to say goodbye or send him off with his favorite tape. But mostly I cried due to the neglect that is the reality of some healthcare systems. M did not deserve to go the way he did. I think back to that letter and know my time with M taught me a lot more than I could have ever hoped for. He brought me more joy than I probably brought him. His sister thanked me for my time with him, but I am thankful for the honor of knowing him. M, wherever you are, I hope you have endless reruns of Titanic and Diet Root beer. Maybe we can play Scrabble one day. But most of all, I hope you have the peace that you deserved. Story 23. Hospital I used to work in had an eye clinic with some laser surgery rooms. Patient with a common surname, let's say Smith, had an eye exam and is told to make a follow-up appointment. He's waiting in line to make an appointment when, from the other side of the clinic, a nurse calls for Smith. He walks over to her and says he's Smith. She leads him to one of the laser rooms. The MD performs the procedure. When they're done, the patient asks, "What did you just do to me?" Story 24. Wasn't employed by the hospital, but worked as an inter-facility transport EMT at the time. Had one patient that had terminal bone cancer and was morbidly obese. I was transporting her from the hospital to a radiation appointment. I developed a rapport with her, and she opened up and told me how she is just buying maybe 6 months by treating the cancer, otherwise she would pass already. Well, as some of you may know, bone cancer is one of the most painful and terrible ways to die. So for her to extend that misery for just a little longer, so she could experience life and see her family a little longer, was very inspirational. We get to the facility to do the radiation treatment and are told it should only take about 45 minutes. Then we get to the room where the magic happens, and the table she's supposed lay on is the same size a small adult would use. They have no modified version for morbidly obese adults. The only way to keep her on are extra straps they use to tie her down to the table. They constantly have to stop the procedure to adjust her for comfort. 2 hours in her fentanyl she was given at the hospital is completely worn off, and the facility isn't authorized to administer meds like that. Appointment ended up taking about 4 hours longer than it should have, and she was just miserable but still so sweet and apologetic the whole time. I felt awful for her, and after it was done there was a huge sense of relief in her voice. I told her how inspirational she was to me to see how resilient she was being. Story 25. Mandatory. Don't work in a hospital, but I did undergo some serious cancer treatment in my early 20s. Cancer sucks. Everyone knows that. But anytime I felt low about my situation, I took a look around the infusion center for chemo and saw kids as young as 5 or 6. And that clearly were numerous cycles further into chemo than me. There wasn't much privacy in the infusion center, and you didn't have much to do but people watch. The look on parents' faces will haunt me until the day I die. There are a lot of things from that time in my life I will never forget. One thing that sticks out is just how awesome the nurses on the chemo ward were. One woman in particular had a way to bring joy to anyone and everyone just by being herself while she did her job. She was as black as midnight, with a respectably large afro and a high Cockney British accent. This was in the States. If heaven ever did speak, this woman was its conduit. Story 26. I'd been a nurse a few years and thought I was pretty awesome. A patient in the ICU was unstable with a heart problem, but with meds was pretty stable when my shift started. She was a DNR with heart failure. The family had been there for days. Husband, adult sons, daughter-in-law. They were the nicest folks. They were contemplating going home for a few hours to shower, eat, and rest. I told them her heart rhythm looked good. Go home and get some rest. I took their cell phone numbers and told them if anything changed, I would call right away. Well, they traveled at last an hour through a dead zone. Because as soon as they walked out the door, I was struggling to keep her alive. Her heart was all over the place. Pressure kept dropping and dropping. I got them on the phone an hour later and told them to come back. I spent 2 hours desperately trying to keep her alive, and they ran back in the door 5 minutes after she was gone. I couldn't stop crying. I felt so bad. There was no professional boundary there at all. We all knew a young, stupid nurse took their last moments with their mother, and mom died alone, with a few scattered staff doing what they could, but without her family by her side. That family comforted me more than I comforted them. I was beside myself. They told me I did my best, and it was okay. The grace and kindness they showed me was incredible and affects the way I treat every family now. Story 27. Well, I'm going to try and lighten the mood in here and be a bit self-indulgent at the same time. The nurse that worked in the hospital said that this is one of the funniest things she's seen. I had brain surgery and a huge wound, about 10 inches. I hadn't had a dump for about 3 days after the surgery, and the nurses gave me some tablets to soften my stool up and coaxed me out of bed to try and bust a crap out. I sat there and strained and strained and slowly. But surely the turf inched. It's way out. But the problem was, it was like concrete, and after straining for so long, I fainted and fell forwards onto the bathroom floor. Anyway, the nurses came in and found me face down and a big turd protruding, sticking out of me like the Tower of Pisa, fully intact. So apparently anesthetic can back you up a bit. The nurse put a glove on and literally pulled the iron bog out of my arse before they cleaned me up. She said it was one of the most satisfying things she has done, and even better, that picking some get boyfriends blackheads. Legend. Story 28. I was a nursing student in ICU. An older guy had been beaten and abused so badly that the doctor's official diagnosis was abdominal catastrophe. It was the first time I understood how someone could be devastated at the prospect of recovery. The look in his eyes when he found out he would have to live with severe, permanent complications stayed with me for years. I remember thinking all the trauma therapy in the world wouldn't be enough to help him. Story 29. I don't work at a hospital, but I was a police officer for 10 years. I was at the local ER when a man had to tell his wife that he hit their daughter. She was riding on a tractor with him and she fell off. Pass immediately. It was the most emotionally charged and horrifying thing I've ever seen, and I've seen a lot of accidents. Has my heart racing just recalling it? Story 30. Homeless guy came into the ambulance with a tooth abscess. The infection was making its way to his heart, so we tried to get as much infection out as we could. Well, the fun part came when we had to do a CT scan. I had to hold this dude's head as we moved him over. He ended up Story 31. It was a younger individual in their 30s who was dragged into their situation through an addiction and was actually supposed to be passed because they were sick, but ended up finding a way out somehow and landed themselves in a local psych ward. Because of their physical health, they were sent to the hospital where they died not long after. I forget why. It was awful, especially with this person being so young. They were swollen all over and bruised before they even died. When the family showed up, they just talked over their body like it was a Sunday dinner. No tears or anything. The whole thing was a mess. Story 32. Not one particular patient, but a common occurrence. I work in the post-op unit, and often people have an NG tube. The purpose of these is the removal of fluids from their stomach due to having a bowel obstruction. Often patients become confused due to meds, age, or whatever. Often they pull it out and somehow end up vomiting diarrhea. That must be one of the most awful things to experience. Story 33. I did security, so I saw some pretty horrible things from every department on a regular basis. The most suffering I ever saw was a man in the ER observation ward dying from liver failure. Lifelong alcoholic with a wife and kids, probably in his mid to early 40s, on a wait list for a new liver. I got called to stand in the room with a nurse while she cleaned him. He was previously restrained by the last security rotation because he was rolling around in his bed during his unconscious delusions, and his nurse was worried he'd fall out of bed. He was completely out cold in an adult diaper covered in his own feces from head to foot. His skin was bright yellow. I had to unrestrain and restrain his limbs one by one as they needed cleaning. She cleaned his own feces out of every crevice as he aimlessly tossed and turned and moaned in pain. He had feces embedded under all his fingernails from scratching at his itchy, feces-covered skin. The nurse cleaned his ass crack while he continued to crap all over himself. Then she'd clean it again. At one point, his wife came in as he was crapting all over himself and violently thrashing around as I held him down to keep him from striking the nurse. She stood in the corner in frozen horror, and I had to tell her to leave immediately and wait outside. The nurse finished cleaning him and put a new diaper on. I got all his restraints fastened back on, and we both left the room. His wife was sitting outside with their daughter on her lap, staring blankly at nothing, didn't acknowledge us as we passed. I don't know what happened to him, but judging by how he looked like day, I don't think he made it much longer. I think about it every day. I'll never forget the smell or the look in his wife's eyes when she walked into the room. That day she saw the love of her life and father of her children reduced to a shell of his former self, covered in his own bodily fluids and moaning in pain, thrashing around violently in a diaper in the middle of some fever dream, nightmare. Whatever was left of the man she fell in love with was gone. I stopped drinking almost completely after that day, and when I see friends of mine with parents that are heavy drinkers, it makes me sad. Whenever I see a funny commercial or some quirky meme or poster about alcohol, I always flash back to that hospital room. Alcohol abuse is no joke, people. If you have a loved one who's an alcoholic, please have them seek help. Nobody deserves to be in his position and suffer through what I saw that day. Story 34. In residency, I took care of a young boy with E. coli. No one knows where he got it, and it wasn't part of a bigger outbreak. I'll never forget the screams of pain from the severe abdominal pain and diarrhea. But then I'd go in the room to check on him, and when I asked him how he was, he'd just say in a weak little voice, "I'm okay," even when doubled over. Such a tough kid. There's no treatment besides supportive treatments. fluids, pain relief, because antibiotics make renal failure more likely. Unfortunately, he did go into renal failure anyways, and he passed before dialysis could be started. In medical school, I took care of a middle-aged woman with advanced uterine cancer. She was extremely obese, 400 pounds, so it was too difficult to do her hysterectomy without first doing a paniculectomy. Because she didn't move, she developed terrible pressure ulcers in her back. She had a ton of fat on her back too, so these ulcers were deep. She'd scream and sob anytime we moved her. I don't remember anyone ever coming to visit her, and I'm pretty sure she eventually passed alone. Story 35. Guiguan resident here, reflecting on time as a med student. 1. I was a third-year student doing internal medicine. This was my second code blue, cardiac arrest, with CPR. My group was the first there, and the nurses were directing us in and reading off the guy's history. 80-something years old, arrived hours before to begin inpatient chemotherapy, had 3 separate independent types of cancer, metastatic melanoma, something in his gallbladder, bile duct, and lung cancer, I think. He must have weighed 80 pounds. Frail. We start CPR, and I'm the second to rotate in, and I just feel ribs popping one after another. I hear the resident say, "Ribs heal, hearts and brains don't. Keep going." The guy is near stripped down. Surgery is trying to put a line into his leg. He has vomit on his face and chest. He's lost his bowel control. After a few minutes, someone says, "We have a pulse," and the guy slowly starts moving his head back and forth. Room relaxes a bit and quiets down as some people disperse, and everyone else just either waits to monitor or start to recap the incident. The guy finally opens his eyes. He couldn't say anything, but you could just see sheer panic in his eyes. They're darting around. He looks absolutely terrified, confused. He starts breathing fast, and you can see the pain with each breath because of his broken ribs. Then, a nurse from the corner of the room pipes up holding a manila envelope. Why did we do CPR if he was do not resuscitate? There was such a simultaneous silence and clutter of yelling and swearing from different people in the room. Apparently, somebody somewhere in his admission had missed the DNR order. And because he had only been in the hospital a short period of time, nobody had noticed that the order was wrong. The gentleman's eyes are still stark open and darting back and forth, as if he knew that he shouldn't still be alive. Maybe he did. He was like that for a few minutes while the attending physician and residents quickly discussed what to do. We lose his pulse after another minute or two and he codes again. This time, and maybe earlier, the resident just pushes IV substances. The man settles. He never made a sound through the whole experience, but finally he was quiet. Eyes rested, breathing slowed, pulse reduced, and he slowly slipped away. I didn't know what to do. Just kept thinking of how scared he looked, half naked, covered in excrement, surrounded by a room full of total strangers. His chest must have hurt so much, and I can only imagine his last thoughts being something of, "This wasn't supposed to happen." I held his hand. I didn't know what else to do, but I didn't want him to be alone surrounded by so many people he didn't know. And even if I didn't know him either, I figured he deserved any amount of comfort available. Dead people are cold. They get cold very fast. I remember his hands feeling too cold for someone who was just looking around. 2. Fourth-year medical student. I was on emergency department elective. I had learned a couple things so far, AAA. People will often tell you exactly what is making them sick. Not always, but often. People are always in pain. Not often, but always. Didn't matter if they had kidney stones, ouch, sickle, cell crisis, diarrhea, yuck, or want a sick leave notice from work for a crushed hand, holy crap, ouch, or bruise on their knee, get out of my emergency department, ouch. Story 36. I'm a children's nurse. I worked on a ward that specializes in brain and spinal tumors in children, amongst other specialties. The worst thing I can think of was a little boy. I think he was 3 or 4 years old. He'd been in a different hospital for 2 weeks with a weakness to his legs that was seeping up his body, eventually causing incontinence. The other hospital hadn't scanned him, which was the first thing we did, and we found his brain and spine were covered in tumors. There was literally nothing we could do. He had weeks, if not days left. On my shift, he was incredibly poorly, and I was trying to push for him to get moved to the ICU. He was barely conscious, and there were a few times whilst I was waiting for the medical team, I actually thought he'd pass in front of me, being with his poor parents as they went through this. Watching their typical, previously healthy child fade away with no information was the worst. The mom asking, "Will he live? Please save my baby." It was truly awful. Story 37. I'm a dentist, and during my study a couple years ago, a friend and myself were placed at a nursing home. This was to educate us about the challenges of oral care in an aged care facility. The home was divided in 3 sections: low care, high care, and terminal. On the first day there, a lot of the residents would approach us and keep doing so throughout the day to become friends with us, as they kept forgetting they had met us only hours before. It was very sweet, and I became attached to many of them. It's surprising how they will forget you in 1 hour, but will never forget growing up on a farm with a sheep called Gilbert. I became closest to a woman called Elsa. that had dementia and another fatal disorder I cannot recall, in the terminal section that was named so due to her long white hair as the Frozen character. Every day I'd feed her, brush her hair, wash her dentures, yet she only ever spoke 2 words, Jessica and Joel. She would repeat both names every day and point to their pictures in her room. They were her children. Speaking to the nurses, I found out that they dropped her off 7 years ago and never came and visited again. Every day, she would get better at remembering me, but never said my name once. Always just Jessica and Joel. I would check up on her during the day, and every time I would see her crying in bed. And I would offer to bring her some water. She would reply with Jessica and Joel. One morning after a month of first meeting Elsa, I walked into her room and she wasn't in there. She wasn't the kind to walk around and always stayed in her room, so I knew something was wrong, and I was fearing the worst. After asking one of the nurses that I hadn't ever met, she told me she passed away last night after gesturing for water and saying the names Jessica, Joel, Joseph. My name is Joseph. I cried just writing you this story. Story 38. In 2009 or 10, I worked as a transport MT. Essentially, my partner and I transported people out of hospitals to specialty care facilities, mostly nursing homes. However, one day in early April, we got a call to transport a young kid, 16, maybe 17, to a more advanced hospital. I can't remember, in NICU or LIG, something like that. Kind of normal, but whatever, just another day, or so I thought. We arrived to the young man sitting on the bed, feet on the floor, and the mother crying by his side. The nurse informed us he was going to the advanced care hospital for monitoring and more tests. During spring break, this kid and 4 of his friends went to the Dominican Republic unsupervised. When they returned, the mother had to physically get the kid off the plane. His brain was literally fried. His friends said nothing happened, and he was normal the whole time. And we promised we didn't do substances. Sure enough, he tested positive for nothing. And the hospital suspected, by way of MRI and EEG, it was most likely mushroom poisoning. The crazy part that made it one of the things that sticks with me is this kid had almost no executive functions, and the MRI showed big old black spots on his brain. He was incontinent, couldn't talk, couldn't eat nothing, but he would follow every command he was given with a shuffling stumble. He walked to the stretcher and sat down on command, waved when told to wave bye to his mom, and had to be told to stop. The nurse even told him to blink, and he did. He was a real-life zombie, almost like he was trapped in his own mind, or parts of it were missing. Seeing the mother so sad and having no idea what happened was the most tragic part of the whole ordeal. Story 39. I've been an RN for 25 years, 3 in an ICU, 10 in an ER, a few short stints in OR, and the last 11 years in Psych ER. Reading this has dredged up a lot of stuff. ICU maybe 22 years ago. Poor man had cancer. He was struggling to breathe. I had his bed upright, and he had on 100% O2 with a non-rebreather. He had orders for 1 milligram of medics an hour as needed. Damn all. This wasn't a teaching hospital, so the nurses would call the patient's doc at home as there were no docs, residents, etc. there, and explain what was up. I could not get an order for anything to help this guy. I felt pretty helpless because he was struggling to breathe. I stayed with him most of the shift until I went home. I don't know what happened as I didn't see him again. Years later, a young guy with Marfan's syndrome came in. His color was crap. He was very diaphoretic. Doc suspected a dissecting aneurysm. He kept asking me for some water. I had to say I couldn't right now, but would soon, lying because he was going to wind up intubated. You can't give anyone anything by mouth for fear of aspiration. He struggled for a while and coded and pass. I felt like crap that the last thing he wanted was water, and I couldn't give him any. 20 years ago, a code on a man, Xmas Eve, which was unsuccessful. We cleaned up the room for his wife, who was en route, but in deaths like that, you have to leave in the lines, et tubes, etc. for the medical examiner. Anyway, we had things as tidy as possible. I went on to some other stuff in the ER happening, and at shift change, I was leaving. I saw the patient's wife alone in the room. We coded him in, sitting on a chair, holding his hand and being quiet. I always see that image. Story 40. This isn't from me, but my mother. She is a neurosurgeon. This little girl, probably 6 or 7 years old, had some form of spinal cancer. My mother had met and talked to her a couple of times. On this particular day, she was excited because her dad was coming home from a business trip to Bali. This little girl was so happy because he was bringing her back a toy. The next day were the Bali bombings, which killed her father. She was distraught and spent the next 4 days just crying with little bits of sleep in between. Her mother spent most of that time with her daughter. About 2 months later, the mother passed away in a car accident while driving to the hospital to visit her daughter. So her grandparents got the duty of care for her, but she passed away 2 weeks later from the cancer. The poor girl suffered worse than I could think in her last 2 months of life, losing most of what was important to her before dying herself. I hope no one goes through anything like that again. My mother thinks she just gave up after her mother passed. This little girl lost everything just by some form of crap luck. My mother does leave flowers on her, and her parents' grave every year on the anniversary of her death. Sometimes I really do not understand how my mother deals with being in her. She is quite possibly the strongest person I know just because of that. Story 41. Okay, so technically, I worked at a nursing home and I myself wasn't a nurse, but one of the kitchen workers who fed the residents. How it works is, I brought up carts of hot food, served the meals on plates according to residents' cards which specified their diets, what they could and couldn't eat. Resident has no teeth, no hard foods, resident can't eat salt, etc. And then the nurses would bring them to designated resident. Sometimes they could eat on their own, sometimes they needed a nurse to feed them. Typically, these meals come with a dessert. Depending on their needs and diet, it could be a piece of fruit or something like a cake or pudding. So during one of my shifts, I had just served dinner to the third floor and was packing up to go back to the kitchen. As I was packing up, there was an old lady who I knew as someone who needed to be fed because she had lost a lot of coordination with her arms and was wheelchair-bound. Her nurse, who was supposed to be feeding her, was too busy yammering away at another nurse. So this resident, who was obviously hungry, tried to feed herself the blueberry pie and naturally kind of makes a mess on herself. Poor lady has blueberry all over her face and shirt, and the nurse, who should have been feeding her, gets upset and decides the resident doesn't get to eat dinner since she can't behave and wheels her into a corner like she was in timeout, all while she's covered in food. The resident is obviously so embarrassed and just wants help being cleaned, but the nurse walks away before she could even finish her sentence. It isn't unusual for residents to not eat food because it was pretty gross, or maybe they weren't feeling it. It happens. So I went downstairs back to the kitchen and cleaned and did my tasks. I usually come back up the floors, usually 3 hours to collect dishes and drop off overnight snacks. I come back up to the third floor, and to my damn horror, that resident is still in that same corner covered in the blueberry sauce. Walked over to the nurse's station and told them about a resident needing help. And thankfully another nurse came in and took her back to her room and cleaned her up because her crafty designated nurse was nowhere to found. I cried that entire night after my shift. This poor woman is in a facility because she needs constant help and care, and she was treated like a damn nuisance by this a whole nurse. Damn that hospital and damn that nurse. Story 42. Mother backed out of her driveway and didn't notice her toddler had crawled into the culvert under the road. The culvert collapsed and hit her daughter. We tried to keep the daughter alive while the mother was hysterical and the father was in shock. That was the worst. I've seen worse graphically, but not emotionally. Story 43. Previously, young healthy nurse in her 20s got meningitis. Ended up with bilateral leg amputations and I think one arm. I went to go see her as a pain consult, and it was so sad. She was basically a torso, enduring painful dressing changes daily, whereas a week before she had been living a completely normal life. Another gem. Man in his 40s or 50s gets an ecstatic call from his wife that they have gotten off the list for an adoption and are soon going to be parents. He then goes to play tennis and collapses on the court. Brought to hospital where a mechanical ventricular assist device is placed, a machine that does the work of the heart. His wife comes to see him and he dies soon thereafter. His wife's last contact had been the adoption phone call. The next contact she had with him, he was intubated, sedated, on life support in the ICU. Another, man in his 50s goes into heart failure, is told he isn't a candidate for heart transplant for whatever reason. He is fully conscious at this point and on some kind of assist device doing the pumping work of his heart for him. He has a friend who had gone through something similar and he knew he didn't want to live with the options available to him, so he elected to be taken off support. He arranged for his parents and his young son to come visit him before the support was turned off. I can't imagine many other scenarios where someone can say a goodbye to their loved ones with full certainty that they are going to be dead in the next 12 hours. That everything they want to say has to be said now. Still makes me teary to think of him now, years later. I was a fellow in the heart failure unit, and this one made me cry on rounds. I couldn't stop myself. Slumped against the wall as this man was facing and accepting his death. Another. Young healthy guy gets endocarditis, develops a vegetation on his mitral valve, throws a fragment, gets a stroke, recovers, goes home, doesn't get surgery for the vegetation, not sure why. Comes back with another stroke because of course the vegetation is still there. This time he doesn't recover, and our team has to tell his wife that he is never waking up. The wail I heard from his wife, heartbreaking. Story 44. Stories from last night, ICU, bed 26. Comes in for elective colostomy reversal. I just came in to help Turner and see this woman with eyes that look dead inside, trached on a ventilator. Massive abdominal wound with wound vac that will obviously never be closed. Massive blisters all over her body from being so edematous. She's wrapped in chucks from head to toe because she's draining so much serous fluid through her skin. Worst part was she only elected for the procedure because her family was mad at her for smelling so much due to the colostomy bag. Bed 16, I just went in to check the alarms. Patient on CVVH. A type of slow dialysis for hemodynamically unstable patients. Toes are purple. I say to the primary nurse, her toes are purple. She replies, just wait till you see her arm. I look at her arm. Her arm is black from the fingertips to the elbow. Black like my PlayStation is black. I say to the primary nurse, she looks dead, is she with it? Nurse replies, she blinks. Family wants everything done. Bed 19, possibly cursed room. STEMI, heart attack, coming from cath lab. Per report, patient has coded 3 times during procedure before patient is stabilized, and they are running levofed wide open. Cath lab calls, hey, we're coming and doing compressions en route, gown up. Gurney comes flying around corner with someone doing compressions on top of frail old man. Blood is everywhere. More staff than I've ever seen at a code ever show up. Easily 10 doctors, residents. Too many people for me. I offer to get the family. Family hopeful upon seeing my stupidly smiling face because I stupidly smile when meeting someone. Tell them, he's not doing well. We're doing everything we can, but he's not going to live much longer. You need to see him now. Could literally see the smiles and color drain from their face as I spoke the words and tears forming in their eyes. People trying to collapse on floors. People crying, praying to God for a miracle, telling us not to stop. 10 rounds of EPI given. 2 crash carts of substances emptied. Floors covered in blood. No miracle. Bed 19. 1 hour after previous patient wheeled out by funeral home. Rapid response from med-surg floor. Patient with hemorrhagic stroke now having mental status change. Shows up snoring heavily, not waking up. Patient vomits and aspirates. Concern for airway. Patient is a DNR, also beginning to have obvious decerebrate posturing. Patient no longer able to speak for self. Family rescinds DNR. We intubate. Anytime we have to watch or put a patient through unnecessary suffering is probably the worst thing they go through. Story 45. A friend's stepdad was training to be a nurse, so he got all the gross stuff that came in because newbie. A homeless man came in complaining of stomach pains. When he told the guy to undress, he didn't want to take off his jeans. When asked about it, he said, I can't take them off. I lost my leg. Sure enough, his leg was rotting. Story 46. Advanced and inconsolable dementia. Young mothers passing of cancer. CPR on the elderly with rib fractures and resulting trauma. Suffering from mental illness following terrible abuse. Seeing the neglect in long-term care. Patients left untouched, unturned, unchanged, unfed for an entire shift. Reporting it and seeing no response. It's damn brutal out there. Story 47. I was a patient in a hospital for a heart issue when I was 22. They kept me for 3 days in the cardiac ward, and I shared a room with an older gentleman who I believe was around 85 based off his visitors. I never saw him behind the privacy curtain. I was completely okay and sitting up in bed working on schoolwork most of my visit. When his family came in, I could tell the situation was bad. His whole extended family came. Everyone from his wife to his grandchildren. He was also on a ventilator that was keeping his breathing up. I'm not a medical person, but as I understand, this tube is down in your throat. On the same night after they all visited, he tried to pull everything off and it set off an alarm and a nurse rushed in. All I could hear from a very muffled voice, as the nurse tried to tell him he needed this equipment to live, was, what kind of life is this? It made me question my own issues and cry in the dark next to him. Story 48. I don't work in a hospital, but my mom does. She worked in long-term care for a minute. She said there is so much that goes on in the hospitals. She said she's had to report several co-workers for over-medicating patients with their heart. Seizure meds to the point of overdosing and lost the patient. She found out the patient passed when she came in the next morning. Nurses were beating the patients if they did something they didn't like. But the one I personally saw was when my great-grandma had hip replacement surgery. She was having trouble using the bathroom. So they gave her an enema. Still didn't help. So they gave another and another and another, but all too close together because they weren't keeping records. Story 49. Working in trauma, I see a whole slew of things, but one always sticks out. Anyone who gets necrotizing fasciitis, flesh-eating bacteria. While it's common in IV addicts, some people can get it from minor cuts, animal bites, etc. People who get neck fash often have to have the area debrided. This makes for long stays in the hospital and generally pain and trauma. It's awful. People often lose limbs due to it progressing so fast and wide. Story 50. I was working patient relations at a hospital in Ohio, and there was this dude named Mike, no more than 20 years old, that came in and hung out in an out-of-the-way lobby almost every week. Mike was one of those guys that never saw anything negative in this life, and made sure to do his best to help others only see the positive. He was easily one of the strongest people I have ever met. Whenever I'd see him, with a smile as wide as the horizon, he'd greet me with one of those hand slap, hug things that bros do. Seeing Mike was always the highlight of my week. Mike always brought a guitar and a backpack with him, and whenever I saw him, we'd sit down and play guitar together and obsess over common music interests. He had great taste and amazing recommendations for new stuff to listen to. Dude wrote his own stuff too and showed me some of his lyrics. Let's just say he could have easily made a living by doing music. Months went by of seeing Mike every week at least once, sometimes twice. I never saw any relatives or anything, so I thought he was just there to visit someone and was usually taking a break. You're not really supposed to ask why people are in a hospital. It's bad etiquette, at least for the position I held. It wasn't until the very last day I ever saw him that a member of the oncology, cancer unit, met Mike in the lobby with an empty wheelchair. The staff member exclaimed towards Mike that he doesn't know why Mike shows up so early and why they always have to look for him. It was then I started piecing it together. One of the registrars called me over to her desk after oncology whisked Mike away in a wheelchair. Mike, of course, insisting the whole way that he can and should walk. The registrar filled in the broken pieces for me. I know, HIPAA violation. Mike was 19. Mike had stage 3 cancer. Mike came to the hospital for his chemo. Mike didn't have any family, so he came alone, from a sort of homeless shelter for young adults. Hours early for his treatments because that was the only time the bus schedule came by. I never saw Mike again after that day. Couldn't find his room? Asked people about him. Nothing. I called all the homeless shelters in the area. Nothing. I might have asked the wrong people or just simply missed him, and he moved on to somewhere else, but for whatever the case, I never saw him again. Mike was the living embodiment of love and strength. I had no idea what he was going through and that he was doing it alone, but the ducker would probably just say with a humongous grin, "I'm not alone. I've got you and everyone in this hospital. We're all family anyways." To this day, I still think about and pray for him and hold on to the hope that I might see him again and tell him about the song I learned on guitar by one of his 9 favorite bands. Story 51. I'll tell you about the reddest patient. I worked in a hospital in Ontario that had a psych ward. There was a patient who liked to be referred to as the mayor, or Mr. Mayor. He was a short, stocky guy who would always wear a suit jacket over his regular clothes. One time he had an outburst and we got called for a code white. He was in the corridor throwing chairs. He was yelling about wanting to go for a smoke, and one of the ward clerks yelled back, "Mr. Mayor, if you calm down and stop throwing chairs and apologize, you can go for a cigarette." We just stood back and watched the situation de-escalate. Then later, we laughed about how absurd that scene was. Story 52. The head and neck ward has a carotid blowout kit for people with neck tumors that are invading the carotid artery and can't be removed. It has towels in it, nothing else. I'm glad to say I've never seen it used, but I once saw an old woman with a nosebleed that no one could get to stop. Just seemed unbelievable that you could pass from a nosebleed, but she did. Story 53. Psychiatric hospital. Definitely dementia, as is covered throughout this thread, but also patients in deep psychosis. Nonstop energy, paranoia, delusions, abuse, aggression, the whole works. Strangely enough, these patients, once sane, are usually the nicest people on the floor. The look of horror and regret when they learn what happened to them and what they did over the previous days kills me every time. Story 54. I went to see a patient during clinical rounds a few years back when I was a med student. I think it was for dermatology. Guy was just a year older than I was. Remarkably fit, fairly good looking, and from what little I got to see of him, was also pretty mild-mannered. Well, so his story was that he loves to play basketball, and he did just so on that fateful day. A quick shower and a wipe down, and he finds red liquids on his towel. Blood came from some weird scab-like growth. No prior symptoms. Freaks out, goes to a neighborhood dermatologist, and is told to go to a bigger hospital, which is where I ended up meeting him. So apparently, he's taken some tests. The prof and I go over to the station to check out the MR. He grills me a bit on what exams I would have ordered, knowing what I did. One of the answers was a PET-CT, and so we checked that out first. Now, for those of you that don't know, a PET-CT checks the uptake of radioactive glucose that has been injected for the test. The more active metabolism an organ has, the more radioactivity it shows, meaning it shows up black. Cancer has a lot higher metabolism than normal tissue, so it's a pretty neat way to check the entire body for metastasis. When we loaded this guy's PET-CT, we were both struck momentarily speechless. His whole spine and both hips were fully covered in black. Bones should not be black. The cancer had spread across his whole body. The prof gave him about 3 months to live, at best. The guy was just 1 year older than I was, and a hell of a lot fitter. It was really eye-opening to see that my young age didn't mean I was immortal or invincible. Since then, I've adopted the motto of memento mori. I still think about him every once in a while. Story 55. It's hard to say the worst. It seems like that bar keeps getting higher and higher. The couple that stand out the most, I suppose, is one was a few years after a failed attempt of death, him paralyzed and heavily brain damaged. When I saw him, he was in his 20 AS, unable to communicate and still suffering from complications from the internal damage. His parents never left his side. They talked to him constantly. His dad would just stay by his side and stroke his hair and tell him how much he loved him. It was absolutely heartbreaking. They talked about all the things he loved to do and how proud they were and never once spoke like he wasn't there or like he was 5, which happens a lot of other times. Pain-wise, I had another young man in his early 20s crushed by a 1,000 pounds piece of concrete in a hole after a safety strap broke. Worse yet, we are talking. This happened out in the most rural part of the bush. His spine was crushed and extensive. and I mean extremely extensive, internal injuries. I was working in the closest hospital in a town of a few hundred people over an hour away from the closest trauma center. It took them close to an hour and a half to get him in the ambulance and get him to us, and there was no helicopters available to air transport. He rode in the ambulance the whole way and was completely lucid, and with it the entire time. Think about that. And he survived, silver lining, emotionally. I was working in a larger center at this point in time. I picked up a shift after New Year's. Everyone likes to party, drink, do substances, and get ducked up. I saw over 30 cases of spousal abuse that day. And not, he slapped me around a little bit. I mean, hit with objects. Some ladies were unrecognizable. Story 56, 2 of them, both senior citizens. They both haunt me years later because I don't know what happened to either of them. The first came in as a homeless woman in the winter. She was fine, medically, but homeless because her husband passed. And her absolute demons of children took the family home out from under her, leaving her on the street. Somehow ended up in my city. They put her on a psych hold, just so she had somewhere to sleep while they figured out where she could go. She was in her 80s. Her entire life was in a grocery bag. The other was a transfer to our ER after being medically cleared elsewhere, because ours has a psych RA, and the other main hospital in the area does not. Also in her 80s, I believe. She was the sole caretaker of her very ill husband, and reached a point where she felt it was impossible. Just everything. Life. She was so tired. So she hired her husband and herself so that they could pass together. He passed, she lived, and was sent for a psych eval. I assume there was a criminal, legal discussion as well. I wish I had remembered her name, just so I could try to find the outcome. Story 57. I was working as a floater, meaning I could be assigned to any floor in the hospital. I was sent to a regular med, surge floor. I heard my patient before I met her. She was screaming. She was a Spanish-speaking woman in her 40s that had a stroke previously, was from a nursing home, admitted for a broken leg. She had a plaster cast on her lower right leg, toes exposed, and there was a wet spot on the cast's heel and a foul odor in the room. The permanent nursing staff informed me that this was just her regular state, screaming, and to medicate her with whatever pain meds were ordered. I had a sixth sense that something was seriously wrong, and that her screaming wasn't just altered mental status secondary to an infarction. From 7 a.m. onward, I informed the surgical team that this was more than just confusion, and as a per diem staff was not being listened to. This went on for hours with my warring with the doctors who refused to take it seriously and at best ordered an antipsychotic, which made zero difference in her mental status. I finally called the nursing supervisor in tears, who listened to my concerns and escalated the matter by speaking directly to the head of orthopedics. 2 residents immediately appeared and the cast was removed. 5 hours later, this poor woman had a stage 4 pressure ulcer on her heel, basically a wound that is deep and rotting with infection. The cast had placed pressure on her already compromised skin, and it was a disaster in the making. I followed up with what happened to her, and I was told they ended up doing a below-the-knee lost. Story 58. Seeing a 24-year-old, the same age as me at the time, come in with difficulty swallowing, then being told he had end-stage esophageal cancer and had weeks to live, whilst his wife was about to give birth. I was there when he was told, and I still to this day don't know how I turned up for work the next day. Having worked there for 5 years already, I'd never experienced anything so awful. He managed a few months, met his son, and died at home. Something that will stick with me forever, I think. Story 59. Last month, my worst patients were a 37-year-old girl with metastatic breast cancer. She had just got out of a failed brain surgery and essentially had really bad short-term memory. Every day, I would round on her. And every day, I would have to tell her there was no more treatment modalities available and that we would have to consider hospice. Every single time she was devastated, but the next morning she would wake up, open her binder and start to formulate a haphazard treatment plan only for me to destroy all her expectations. Hospice took a long time to arrange, so she was my patient for 2 weeks. Literally dreaded seeing her every day. A 78-year-old man who basically lived out in the boonies and never married, never had kids, never had much in terms of a life. He basically came in with a moderate case of pneumonia, but the strange thing is that he was hell-bent on dying. He kept claiming that he was here to die and that he was scared, but he didn't want to keep going. He said he was just so miserable. Looking at his blood work, vital signs, and x-ray, the guy wasn't too bad off. 2 days later, he passed right after breakfast. A 72-year-old lady who came in with severe abdominal pain, she had beginning signs of dementia, but her husband that came in with her was fully demented and relied on her for everything. She kept saying that she was dying and that by the end of the day she'll be gone. Turned out she had an abdominal aortic aneurysm, and it was pretty much ready to burst. We treated her to make her comfortable since surgery was not an option in her case. Her husband kept patting her hand, telling her to go to sleep, and she'll feel better when she wakes up. She eventually passed away, and the husband thought she was asleep. We kept trying to tell him that she passed away, but he kept laughing and patting. her hand saying that she was just asleep. This was just the month of January in one of the better hospitals I worked at. Crap's no joke. Story 60. I was doing a clinical rotation in the ER. The ambulance called and said they were about 10 minutes out with a 19-year-old male with a close range wound to his upper left chest area. Think, the front of your shoulder, just below the collarbone. He came home early and some guys were robbing his house, so they hit him and took off. His parents had to wait in the lobby for the police to finish up with him before they could see him. The angry look on his father's face and the wailing sound that his mother was making are not things I will soon forget. Kid made a full recovery BTW. He's got a small scar and story to tell. Story 61. When we get to a point where we are calling family or POO about intubation or DNR status, and they have a flimsy excuse why they can't come to the hospital, come hold your parents' hand while they pass. Being there is the last kind thing you will ever be able to do for them. Also, the words, "do everything you can," are sometimes so cruel. Some of the worst suffering seems to come from patients in their late 90s getting intubated and having invasive procedures because the family can't just be there and let them slip away. Alone and neglected and intubated is the worst thing every single time. Story 62. Saw the patient afterwards. Interacted with someone who was admitted for chest pain. They explained that they had had an aortic dissection. I saw him a few months later for a follow-up appointment. Also, when I was in school, heard the story from another radiography student who had an air patient admitted for a blockage. It was a sex toy. Story 63. The first death witnessed. Seeing a relatively young patient, 20, 30 years old, who fainted at home and brought in by EMS, going into distress and vocalizing difficulty breathing before she went into cardiac arrest. Despite the efforts of CPR and prompt medical intervention over 45 minutes, she was not resuscitated, and the news had to be broken to her parents, husband, and child. That she is roughly the same age as me, and that she was well the day prior is more shocking. Story 64. I'm a phlebotomist. I started my job last year, and my second week I met this patient who was essentially in a vegetative state. He had brain function, but he was pretty severely brain damaged. He was a former addict. He kept using instead of going on antiretroviral and was just all around a sad person. I felt awful for him. He started young and was dying young, 26. I couldn't get the veins in his hands or arms, so I'd have to use his foot. Then he'd go home. Over the next year, he'd keep coming in, straight to ICU, always in worse condition. Eventually, he became entirely brain dead. He was alive with no brain function. His family refused to take him off life support. Every day, I'd have to go in and draw his morning labs. I was doing blood work and poking more holes in a man who will never recover. His quality of life was awful. One time, he opened his eyes and blinked when I was getting a troponin on him, and his mom jumped up and screamed, "Get the doctor, he's waking up!" I calmly explained I'd get the doctor, but blinking doesn't mean he has brain function. She called me a stupid and told me to leave. She then was escorted out by security because she proceeded to get violent with the next two doctors who told her the same thing. I've been out of work for a couple months now since delivering my daughter, but I asked about him at my work conference today. He's still there, still being poked and prodded, still suffering, still being kept alive. Story 65. Not me, but my mom. She said that this one lady who was at least 500 pounds was supposed to be moved, rolled, and taken places by the CNAs. However, this did not happen. The lady continued to ring her nurse call button, but nobody responded. After a while, my mom noticed that nobody had been in there to roll her. Upon checking, she realized that this lady had developed massive blisters and sores from sitting in her wheelchair. Eventually, these had gotten infected, and the lady had to be moved to ICU. Story 66. I'm a pediatric nurse and was working a Saturday night in the air when we had a teenage boy come through for flash pulmonary edema related to his pulmonary veno-occlusive disease. He knew that he was dying. He had experienced this too many times, and now his body can't take anymore. We brought him into our trauma room, and he was sating 33% on 15 LNRB. PT was totally with it. He was blue and kept his eyes close, but he was able to answer questions. His mom kept telling us, "Please give him more time, he will work through it. Call his cardiologist." His cardiologist just happened to be on call that night and came immediately to the ER from the cardiac ICU. He walked through the door and told the mom, "You and I need to have a talk." The room changed instantly. Everyone knew what was happening. Mom had known this day was coming. She fell to her knees. The doctor told her we would move him to the ICU, but the goal is to keep him comfortable. So while we are working on getting a line and labs on this kid, his mom is sitting next to him quietly talking to him and telling him there's nothing else we can do. She's sorry, she never wants him to hurt. He just kept telling her it's okay and he understands. He wants to be at peace. We move him up to cardiac ICU and he starts to code. Mom wanted everything done. The ICU staff coded him 4 times and then he finally passed. His dad didn't make it in time to say goodbye. Story 67. Don't work for a hospital exactly. I do medical transports between hospitals. Had a patient that was deaf and took, among other things, half a bottle of Tylenol. Went to sleep expecting never to wake up. but when they did, they changed their mind and called 911. They were rushed to the hospital and treated. I encountered them several months later. Thanks to the Tylenol, their liver was failing. They were jaundiced and in constant abdominal pain. I was taking them to another hospital for a last-ditch liver consult. One of the nurses told me that the patient was on the transplant list. But since they had a history of death, they were bumped by anyone without such history, so had no real chance of getting one. Sad to see someone slowly dying, and knowing it, because of one decision they made and almost immediately regretted. They were in their 40s, if I recall, so still would have had plenty of time otherwise. Story 68. I don't work in a hospital, but my grandpa went through too much. He was a farmer for 80 years. Started when he was 14, and he wouldn't slow down for anything. My uncle bought the farm when my grandpa started getting too old, but my grandpa still helped as much as he could. Due to the farming, he had COPD. He also had Alzheimer's. The COPD made it hard to breathe. He wasn't getting enough oxygen. This caused his dementia to worsen rapidly. I don't know if this was related to the lack of oxygen, but he went into something that my mom told me was called AFib. His heart was beating unbelievably fast. We took him to the hospital and they diagnosed him with congestive heart failure. They sent him home and his legs would retain water. We'd try to keep them up, but he'd forget and put them down. Then he'd get mad at himself for forgetting again. It took a while to finally get hospice at the house. He would not go into a nursing home between October and the end of the year. He went to the hospital about 4 times. He signed a DNR. He was lucid that day. We finally got hospice. 2 weeks later, he fell. The hospice nurse wasn't strong enough to hold him up when he was getting into the wheelchair. The next morning, exactly 1 month ago today, he passed away in his sleep. It was such a fast, terrible decline. He knew his mind was going, and that was the worst part of it. He didn't want to be alive anymore when he was lucid, and it was so hard to watch. The last time I ever saw him, 2 days before he passed, he didn't recognize me. It hurt a lot. I spent so much time with him when I was growing up, so how could he not know me? I wasn't mad, and I'm still not. I know he didn't want to forget me. I know that he loved me. He was such a good, loving person. He didn't deserve to suffer the way he did. Story 69. My experiences are nowhere near as bad as some of these, but I worked in housekeeping a long time ago, and 3 incidents have always stuck in my memory. 1. I was working on the floor in the ER when a little girl was brought in screaming. Turned out she was jumping on the bed and fell at one point, nearly lost her tongue. They couldn't give her anesthesia for some reason, but needed to perform some sort of procedure. This was going on in the ER theater, so I don't know the specifics. So they basically had to hold her down while they did whatever it was they needed to do. The girl was repeatedly screaming, "Why are you doing this? It hurts!" And every nurse on the floor was weeping. 2. I was working overnight and was called up to the 2nd floor for a mop cleanup. I got my stuff and went up the elevator, only to be hit with the smell of feces. An elderly patient woke up in the middle of the night and was disoriented. So they got up to find out where they were. They were so out of it that they didn't realize they had lost control of their bowels and were crapping themselves as they walked down the hall. 3. I was called to another mop cleanup in the radiology department. An elderly patient had to get a lower GI X-ray performed, and that requires a barium enema, so everything shows up clearly. Well, the patient wasn't able to hold it in while they were getting set up, and the barium was all over the floor. The techs were cleaning up the patient when I arrived, and the look of utter humiliation and resignation on the patient's face made me feel so horrible for them. I'm terrified that I'll turn out like the disoriented patients and just be a husk of a person with barely enough mind power to function. It is a horrible manner of existence. Story 70. It was more of the parent than my patient, but I'll never forget. It was my first day in the pediatric ER as a new grad respiratory therapist. We get a page that a 2-IDO is coming in, no ITE, and no report on what the trauma is. He arrives not breathing, and a heart rate going between 50-70. We do CPR in little kids below 60 FYI. I grab the bag, mask, and take over breathing while he begins to vomit everything out over several minutes while the residents are trying to put a breathing tube down his throat. It's everywhere, and then he starts to have seizures on top of it all. Mom is at the end of the trauma room, foot of bed, watching everything, crying her eyes out. We get this tube in and CT scan the head. I forgot what it was called, but his brain was mush from blunt force trauma. Suspected abuse. I watch the neurosurgeons tell Mom her child is brain pass with no emotion, like this is an everyday occurrence. He tries to ask what happened over and over. I will never forget that wailing cry. It echoed throughout the air. She dropped to her knees, wailing, and turned to the team near the child, screaming through tears to give him blood. It'll fix him. That cry haunted me for a few weeks. Another one is a 7YA. A patient who had a genetic lung disease was extremely combative and rarely did her treatments and medication. This caused her to end up with a breathing tube on life support, ventilator, in the ICU. She had a board and she always pointed to 3 things. I want sleepy substances. I want pain substances, and I'm scared. The parents refused to take her off because she was completely mentally aware, but her lungs couldn't support life any longer. The attending doctors tried to convince the family to let go as she will never recover, but she spent roughly a month pointing to those 3 items on her board until her heart gave out. Story 71, pediatric oncology, a girl. Practically the worst cancer diagnosis you can get as a child odds-wise. There have not been new treatments for this disease in many years, and last I heard the 5-year survival rate was under 20%. This child has many surgeries for her left hip tumor, her primary tumor. She had a fraternal twin sister who was always with her over the course of the 3 years she was treated. You could slowly see a huge difference in their growth and development. This child practically remained physically 7, while her twin sister grew to 10, very normally and healthily, after long and arduous treatment courses. There were no further options, and the child was placed on palliative care, comfort measures, hospice. We didn't expect to see her again, but she was admitted one night because her hip tumor had grown, so large that the skin over it was pulling itself dangerously tight. They came to the hospital hoping there was something they could do to alleviate the impending disaster, when the tumor actually burst, all over the child, her mother, and her twin sister. These twins had an incredible bond, and watching them be parted so the ill one could be rushed to undergo a surgical washout was heartbreaking. You could tell they both weren't sure they'd see each other again. She made it through surgery, but passed a couple weeks later at home. I still see her Facebook updates through some people at work's pages. And the surviving twin is an absolutely stunning 16-year-old girl now. It's terribly sad to think about what she could have been, especially when you see her other half. Story 72. Not so much saw a patient go through, but their family. 3 sisters were in a car accident and 1 passed. The 2 other sisters were unconscious, and I heard the second sister crying with family after she regained consciousness. That was awful, but it was nothing compared to when the 3rd sister awoke. The sounds that she made while crying and enraged were absolutely heartbreaking. She was with her family in the waiting room in the ER, and you could hear it through our whole ER. I will never forget the sound of her screaming for the rest of my life. When I first started working at my hospital, I was a patient companion assigned to sit with an elderly patient who kept trying to wander the halls. I'll never forget that day because a CNA came up to me and told me how awful sitters, nickname for my position, were and how we should all be fired. Then she proceeded to tell me to not talk to my patient at all. Apparently, he was easily angered and she didn't want to deal with him. Clearly, this lady was off her rocker, so naturally I talked to him anyway because staring at him for 8 hours in silence seemed super awkward. Turns out he was a really fantastic guy who enjoyed having someone to talk to and tell war stories to. He was only cranky because he had pain spasms that radiated out from his jaw and everyone would pester him during them. When he just wanted to be left alone for that time, I was pissed that I almost missed out on that nice day with him because of a crappy coworker. A few months later, I sat with him again and he was pretty far gone mentally, but I got to meet his grandkids and tell them a nice story about him. So although I'm pretty certain he passed, it kind of had a nice ending. Story 73. Also, once I had a patient who got a biopsy for a lump on her breast. The lump was removed and all she needed was a few courses of chemo or radiation. I can't remember. Anyway, the cure rate was high. She wouldn't even need a mastectomy. Well, she decided to forego medical therapy for some herbal medicine bullcrap. 2 years later, she walks into the hospital smelling like a dead animal carcass. I gently lifted her gown to look. She had no discernible nipple. She had a crater full of pus halfway up her breast. Her lymph nodes in her armpit had swelled so big that she could no longer put down her arm. The oncologist, who was near retirement, had never seen a cancer so bad. The weirdest part was that the woman was in such denial that she described it as just a little cancer and no big deal. BTW, I'm a hospitalist, a physician who specializes in hospital medicine. Story 74. A different thing from really gnarly diagnoses is when a family member insists that the patient be kept alive with repeated CPR so the family can keep getting a check in the mail. Those people are like idiots in my eyes, making someone suffer for a dollar amount. Story 75. An 86-year-old woman being operated on by a neurosurgeon to remove a slow-growing brain tumor to finish her days in a SNF with a fractured personality, watching a 20-year-old diabetic addict. Hundreds of different patients with strokes facing the pain of a life no longer accessible, and as a reminder of pending death. A 26-year-old father of 2 toddlers, losing control of his balance, heartbeat, and breathing as cancer grew on his brainstem. Watching the horror as his wife and kids helped him prepare to die, while they prepared to walk on without him. The hundreds of patients that were desperate to regain function they had lost, only to see their hopes fade as their bodies refused to recover sufficiently. The just-retired rancher celebrating his toddler grandkids and got out of his pickup, breaking his hip in 2 places, which later turned out to occur because of pathological stage 4 bone cancer. He passed 1 month later. The old widow that wouldn't accept her husband was dying until the moment he died, and her absolute despair at knowing nobody would love and care for her like he did. Story 76. physician, hospitalist here. On the adult inpatient wards, we don't see the horrific trauma and heart-wrenching pediatric deaths that take place in the ER and on the pediatric wards. I'm sure there are plenty of stories on those subjects in this thread. One of the worst deaths I ever saw was as an intern in the ICU. A young guy in his 40s suffered a stomach bleed. It was pretty heavy while in the ER, and he was bad off enough to be sent to the ICU. Blood pressure was 40s, which isn't compatible with life over a prolonged period of time, even with pressor meds to keep it up. The gastroenterologist came in the middle of the night to attempt an emergency stomach scope. We couldn't replace the blood that he was losing fast enough. The patient's partner made the decision to transition to hospice care. He passed in 10 minutes after stopping the pressor medications and taking him off the ventilator. The stomach bleeding was related to severe alcohol abuse, unfortunately. Story 77. Had a patient 1 year old, suspected meningitis, unresolved fever for 10 days. Parents refused to do a spinal tap and refused medication. Says that after admission for 3 days, the medication is not working and wants to be discharged. We tried convincing them not to, but they left anyway. To me, the worst is that children pays for their parents' stupidity. Story 78. I'm new to my job at the mental hospital, so I'm sure my answer will change in a month or so. But we've got a lady with dementia who screams for help for hours. She takes her meds without a fight, but they only do so much. She thinks she's been kidnapped, and you can't talk her out of her delusions. That's her reality. She's really suffering. Oh, wait. She did stop screaming for help for a bit and start screaming for a shoe. She thought just one of her shoes had been stolen. In reality, she was only wearing socks. Story 79. Worked in a nursing home as a cook, so I only saw the residents when they came to the kitchen. However, there were usually 5 or 6 people we would often see come in and just sit there and talk with anyone or stare out the window for a few hours. I got pretty close to most of the ones who came in. One guy was real talkative and liked to talk about his past on the farm and when he was in the army. He pretty aware and able for the most part. Only major problem was he couldn't use his legs, so he was in a wheelchair. Then he had a stroke. After that, he just started to fade. He would talk about his farm still, but it was never complete sentences. Just random words blurted out. Soon he barely talked and wasn't remembering where he was. Then a few months later, he couldn't push himself around anymore and soon after wasn't able to eat, so they had to put him on a puree diet and feed him. He passed shortly before I quit. Worked there for 2 years, and in that time saw him go from a happy, positive guy to someone who was quite literally lost every day in their own home. Story 80. There have been 2 instances where I or a coworker has cared for a patient who was perfectly fine, healthy, happy, going about a normal day when suddenly their mental and physical state took a 180. Going from a normal, functioning, independent person to unable to talk coherently, move on their own, control their bladder and bowels, eat, and unable to do anything except cry within a 24-hour period. Absolutely devastating for them and their families. Story 81. I was 25 at a time, and I will never forget this. I had seen a young woman around the hospital. I assumed she was likely some sort of high-risk pregnancy, as she was really young and appeared to be about 7 or 8 months pregnant. My heart fell when I was working on the palliative care floor, and I watched her walk into a room there, her room. I later had her as a patient and learned she was a liver failure and an addict. She was 24. I had her as a patient almost every night that I worked for about a month. She would wait up for me, and we would listen to music and talk. I was one of the only attendants she would allow to stay in her room. Most were kicked out into the hall. She didn't have many friends or family left, as is the case with many addicts, so her visitors were minimal. I watched for a month as she got bigger, turned yellow, became increasingly confused, and leaked so much fluid from her skin that she left puddles under her wheelchair. Once she became unconscious, they didn't need us to stay with her anymore, but I continued to visit on my breaks and talked with her a bit, so she would know she wasn't alone. The day my friend's son was born, I went up to check on her, only to find someone else in her bed. She had passed away during the night, my day off. Story 82. I wouldn't say this is the worst, but she is one of those patients whose story made me upset. A young lady who just finished chemo for breast cancer came in with behavior changes. She would scratch the staff, pull out her IV and lines. At one point, it got so bad that we had to restrain her. Whenever we give her an antipsychotic, she calms down and becomes lucid. But when it wears off, she's very aggressive. She's still in the hospital, but very sad because she's so young and was normal before the chemo. Story 83. A kid yelling, "Daddy, wake up," to his passing father laying in the emergency room. Damn that job. If you go to an emergency room, be extra nice to those people. Story 84. My first nursing job was on an oncology unit. In my short time there, I did the best I could to help my patients be comfortable and to have a peaceful death. Cancer is not a good death. The worst thing I saw had to do with a patient I had who was in his early 40s and had a family with young kids. The guy had cancer and was in his last days. He would not live to see his daughter's 7th birthday in 2 weeks. So, with the help of my unit and the man's wife, We cleared out a visitor's area and threw a party for his daughter for her upcoming 7th birthday. I medicated him for pain, but not too much so he wouldn't be over-sedated, and then wheeled his entire bed to the area because he was too fragile to move. I then excused myself and cried harder than I had since my father passed. I wheeled him back afterward and medicated him enough so he could sleep through his pain. He died a few days later when I was on my off day. I stopped working in oncology about a month later and almost quit nursing entirely. I still get really upset if I think about it too long. Story 85. Tiny, frail, elderly lady with dementia and the worst case of shingles I've ever seen. Open, weeping blisters everywhere. Confused and half-blind, she tried to crawl over the bed rail and fell onto the side of her face, which basically exploded. She did pass away a couple days later. Elderly man who was still living in his own home, but supported by his son, and checked on occasionally. Son deploys and leaves the duty to his wife, who wants nothing to do with the old man, and hires a caregiver. Caregiver picks up her paychecks, says everything is going fine periodically, but in reality, shows up every few days, weeks. Elderly man eventually falls and is undiscovered for days. Comes to us in a state of starvation, covered in rat bites. I have never seen anybody as emaciated as that man, except in photos. He made a full recovery after a very lengthy rehab. Son got a divorce. Story 86. I don't work in a hospital, but while I was in a hospital post-op from a surgery on my stomach, I was told to walk around and try to get my strength back. While walking, I found out that I was the only kid in the whole wing that wasn't in a huge bus crash that left almost 24 elementary school students pass. I found out when my mom asked what happened, and the nurse explained there was a horrible bus crash. Story 87. 4-month-old pass of pneumonia. Mother was out of town for the week for bachelorette party. Dad was taking care of baby with a cough. Went to check on her around 3 a.m. to find her blue and not breathing. By the time she arrived in the eddy, it was too late. Hearing the mother's scream via phone after being told that her infant was the pass still gives me chills. Another one. I saw the same guy come 4 times in 4 months from an overdose. Every time his parents would pay for him to go to rehab, and 4 times he relapsed and overdosed within a week of sobriety. The 4th time his parents didn't find him in time, and it was too late. They were able to revitalize him, but he was down for so long he was brain pass. Seeing his parents, who gave him every opportunity to help himself, have to make the decision to pull him off life support was heartbreaking. Story 88. At the trauma center, 4-year-old boy was brought in because he ran into a street to get his ball. Van doing 45 miles per hour in a 25 miles per hour zone hit the boy. Worst part was seeing everyone working on the little boy and the dad covering him and holding him and crying his heart out. The dad was wearing a white t-shirt and jeans, and he was covered in his son's red liquid. I was working on another patient in Trauma Bay 2, boy was in Bay 1, where a girl was heavily intoxicated and got hit by a car doing 60 in a 45. Her legs were completely broken. Seeing it all in the same frame was the worst thing I've seen in my life. I can't verbally tell the story without crying. Story 89. I don't work in a hospital, but I'm a CNA in a nursing home rehab center. A gentleman in his 50s came in with stage 4 bone cancer. Over the course of 8 months, he went from being able to walk around just fine, happy, and cheerful, to slowly declining to the point he couldn't get up without help, to not being able to get up or move at all. Even when he first came in, he would be up all night screaming in pain because the meds wore off, and then it progressed to screaming and writhing all throughout the day. The last time I saw him, he was oddly calm. He asked me to sing him a lullaby. His favorite song was Stella by Starlight. I sang to him for a good long while. I had to leave the room to answer call lights and help with dinner service. When I came back an hour later, he was gone. His body was already cold. He had passed within minutes of me leaving his side. I cried the entire time I performed his final care, singing that song to him over and over. Story 90? Lady came into the ICU, non-compliant diabetic, basically laid on her side all day and ate. Her entire front abdominal wall had lost all circulation. Everything had to be surgically removed to try to save her, leaving her with her bowels exposed. We kept her in an isolation room. Every hour or so, we had to go in, clean the wound, and keep wet dressings on her. Her circulation would not improve. She died a slow, agonizing death over almost a month, worse than any horror special effects I'd ever seen. Story 91? Patient. His temp stayed above 106, even covered in ice packs. This pretty much fried his brain, but then his tiny blood vessels started to clog, so he went blind. By the time he passed, after months, he was a blind torso vegetable. Story 92. Worked in a hospital. 1. Guy came into the ER after working on his car that exploded in his face. 2. A guy whose wife was in the hospital as she was just diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. He was distraught. I took him on a walk around the outside of the hospital, tell him to take her everywhere she wasn't to go now. Spend time and take pics. They did for 4 weeks. They ended back in my care and she died a week later. Rip Barbara, I'll never forget you. 3. This was a personal thing when my granddad was dying. We had signed a DNR and he was on comfort care only. I had a very persistent nurse who said she would call security if I didn't let her take blood. I told her if she touched him, I would hit her. I wasn't in my right mind. Story 93. Behavioral health here. Crippling depression is one of the saddest and most pathetic states I've seen another human in. A patient was literally begging and trying to convince us to just let her hit herself. She was sobbing and drenched in her own tears while saying that she just wanted to pass. Please, I just want to die. It'll be quick. Please, just let me pass. I just don't want to be alive anymore. I could hold back my tears. I just started streaming out of my eyes while restraining her. That moment has kept me going, knowing that people really need help, and just being there can do that. My heart was breaking, and it hurt to witness this. I couldn't imagine how deep her heart felt. I think it resonated because of my own battles with depression, but watching it happen in front of me just ruptured every foundation I was currently standing on. Story 94. I am a hospital social worker in a large hospital in Baltimore, MD. I witness horrific suffering every day. I feel like I exist in another plane of reality that most others don't see. I go home to a normal life and return to misery and despair in the morning. I'm not sure if anyone will read this, but please know I try with all of my heart and soul to make these situations less crafty. I don't always succeed, but I try. Embrace every single day, every breath. Hold your loved ones close every single night, because you have absolutely no idea what tomorrow will bring. Don't take a single healthy day for granted. I know this sounds cheesy, but please take my words to heart. We think we have it under control. What an illusion. Complete an advance directive and designate a surrogate decision maker, no matter how old you are. Every single healthy day is a precious gift from the universe. Peace and love. Story 95. When I worked in the NICU, it was always horrible when a baby passed, having to call the parents to come immediately or watching them hold their infant while they pass. It was really tough some days. Story 96. This one guy came in with an entire extension cord shoved up inside because he got caught hooking up with some guy's wife, and the guy flipped out and shoved the entire thing inside. I never saw him after he went in to get it removed. Probably moved to a different country. Story 97. Alls. That is possibly the worst way to go. One minute, he was a successful teacher that had hobbies such as rock climbing. Next thing, he was constantly fatigued, then started experiencing muscle weakness. Doctors thought it was a mild issue related to like carpal tunnel. Before 6 months are up, he was unable to walk properly, limb weakness. Next thing, he could not swallow properly. Now confined to a wheelchair after a year and a half. Soon, he could not control his body. Muscles unable to hold head up, can't do anything for himself. Muscles wasted away. Breathing and swallowing became hard. Ended up on a ventilator. Pain and eventually pass in 2.5 years. Damn, alls, man, it is a terrible disease. Story 98. I work in a hospital, but in the information technology field. One day about 2 months back, our hospital went on lockdown because a female patient wandered through the front doors naked. Apparently, she had been sitting in her car across the street when a male walked up to her car and hit her multiple times before abuse her and leaving her in her car to pass. She managed to get all the way across the street and through our parking lot without being noticed. She survived, and the dude was caught, but I think it remains as one of the most random acts of evil that I have ever experienced, even if secondhand. Story 99. Guy got kicked in the balls and didn't come into the hospital for about a week. Unbeknownst to him, he also had a secondary infection that was spread to his junk and balls during the injury. We ended up degloving his testicles and penis. He went totally septic and wasn't responding to any antibiotics. Toes started going necrotic, so we took them. Feet started going necrotic, so we took them. Legs necrotic, so we took them. The family was hoping for a miracle and wanted everything done to save him. By the time both legs and the digits of his right hand were removed, the surgeon came in and started screaming at the family that what they were doing was unethical. Ethics committee got involved, and the decision was finally made to withdraw support. He passed within 10 minds. Everyone on the floor was so emotionally drained during that time, it was a relief when he passed. Story 100. A dude in his 30s who was playing with his kid on a trampoline. Fell off, broken neck, wheelchair, tetraplegic, minimal use of his hands. From fitness, independence, career, etc., to complete, permanent disability in 1 second. Bang. Just, what the heck do you say to that guy? It won't get better. It's not like he's 80 and nearing the end anyway. And it's not even like he was drunk driving or tombstoning or whatever. He was just really unlucky. Story 101. I saw a patient wake up during surgery. I'm not a medical officer. I'm it. I was in the operating theater to repair a printer the anesthetist uses to print records of the patient's vital signs for the records. Things have to be going according to plan for the OR manager to let support staff into the room. It was almost serene in there. Then the patient started making an urgent moaning sound, and someone said, "He's waking up." A nurse took me by the arm and firmly escorted me to the door. I've read that there's something like a 0.5% chance of this happening. Since I only went into theaters during a procedure a handful of times a year, it was funky odds for both of us. Story 102. I'm a nurse. Had a patient who took care of horses. She was kicked in the head, traumatic brain injury. She was 20-something beautiful, had her fiancé and family there constantly trying to calm her. She was physically strong and had no ability. Speak meaningful words, mostly sounds moans. She would not sit still, and a cocktail of Keppra, Ativan, and other anti-seizure meds had a few brief periods of rest, followed by her trying to sit up and move in an uncoordinated manner, trying desperately to get out of bed. She eventually went to a subacute rehab. They put in a feeding tube. I wonder if her fiancé stuck around, if I would have had the fortitude to be there for her. I have a young daughter that took horseback riding lessons. She fell off and luckily only sprained her wrist and lost interest. Story 103. Recently, we coded a baby 8 times in one night. We should have let go after the first code, but unfortunately the epinephrine kicked in. After 40 minutes of CPR, our parents were unrealistic about the baby's chances of survival. This baby had no chance of survival, but they wanted everything done. So we assaulted this poor baby's body 8 times. Before the attending finally told the parents that we could do this all night, but in the end there was nothing that could be done for this infant's survival. Story 104. I'm speaking as a former patient rather than a medical worker. The burn unit. Outside certain rooms of the burn unit, they put a picture of what each patient used to look like to remind those who walk in to treat them like people. Friends and family members are not allowed to be present for dressing changes because it is too traumatic. I got complimented by a nurse during a dressing change, where I was on medics, heavy-grade painkillers, that I was the first patient she did a dressing change on that didn't scream or cry, so I opted to silently whimper and exhale. Story 105. We have what we call the 6th floor, which is our psychiatric unit. It's usually voluntary for patients to admit themselves, because they want the help, which is why it was so unnerving to find out a girl my age end her life about a month ago up there. Nobody expected her to get through it as she was put on a ventilator and had brain damage, but thankfully she's woken up, been talking, writing, all sorts of things. So far, that's the worst. For a hospital, I know that's not much, but I just started in November, so we'll see. Story 106. My wife told me about a young father coming in with an annoying permanent headache, diagnosed with a terminal brain tumor, and pass a few days later. Of all the stories she told me, this one was the worst because it hits close to home and can happen to everyone.